Hello and welcome to The Big Middle. I'm Susan Flory with the third and final episode from the recent Longevity Leaders Conference in London. Longevity Leaders is a global network connecting all the stakeholders in the emerging longevity industry. Think of it as helping minds meet money to forge the future. My guest is a superstar of this space. Biomedical gerontologist Aubrey de Grey is, by many a reckoning, a genius. He believes the first person to live to be 1,000 years old has already been born. Dying to find out why and how, Aubrey. Delighted to catch up with you.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
You are so far off mainstream lifespan projections by about 900 years. Do tell me about this. How'd you come up with this?
Well, it's actually not as far off the mainstream as you think. It's certainly far off the mainstream in terms of the actual number. And in fact, even that is actually an understatement, because what I really say is that there is going to be no limit at all to how long people can live. The number 1,000 is just a kind of, a number plucked out of the air. But the logic that leads me to that conclusion is logic that a lot of other people are at this point taking seriously. They may not feel that it's as likely as I think, but they definitely don't think that it's crazy. So let me tell you what that logic is. It's very straightforward, really. All it really arises from is the fact that when we achieve even a little bit of postponement of the ill health of old age, like maybe 20 or 30 years, the way we're going to do it is by rejuvenation. In other words, by taking people who are already in middle age or older, let's say in their 60s or 70s, and genuinely restoring them, repairing the damage that they have accumulated so that they are biologically like young adults again. Now, that's really important for lifespan predictions, because what it means is not only that over the subsequent 10, 20, 30 years, they will have a very low risk of death on account of being biologically young, but it also means that we've bought all of that time to improve the quality of the therapies that we applied to them originally, that gave them those extra few decades.
How does this happen? Would every aging, decaying cell, every organ, would it have been scientifically modified or replaced in these 60 and 70-year-olds?
Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, it's pretty complicated. That's why we can't do it yet. But the upshot really is that we can say that at the molecular and cellular level, the structure and composition of all our tissues will be more or less restored to how it is in a young adult. Sometimes that means replacing cells. Sometimes it means cleaning out waste product, garbage. Sometimes it means cleaning out cells that are badly behaved cells. Sometimes it means somehow restoring the molecular structure of long-lived material that has become damaged. So, a variety of different approaches that all need to work. And that's why we have a lot of different projects working in very diverse areas, developing what will eventually be a kind of divide and conquer panel of interventions to do all of this repair.
Well, are you doing that type of research that will take us to this far off place? I mean, we can talk more about the timeline. At SENS Research, the research facility that you founded, I understand, several years ago with a very large inheritance. I mean, you're putting a lot of your own money behind this.
Well, first of all, let me just address the last part of that question. So the foundation actually happened sometime earlier than that. The first version of the foundation was actually created in 2003, and the current version, SENS Research Foundation, came into existence in 2009, and that was by virtue of the donations that we were able to attract from other people, from a wide variety of people around the world, including a small number of quite wealthy people. The first really wealthy person who came in was Thiel, starting in 2006. So the contribution that I made that you're referring to was not until roughly the end of 2011, when I was able to donate something like $13 million out of the inheritance that I received from my mother when she died about 6 months previously. And that certainly helped us along. It more or less doubled the budget of the foundation over the subsequent 5 years, but it was not the thing that actually got the foundation to exist in the first place.
Okay, got you. And you've also got backing from some pretty powerful banks, Citibank, Barclays?
Well, backing in the sense of positive, publicity, yes. But the backing that we have in terms of financing at the foundation comes from individuals. So Peter Thiel, as I said, started funding us back in 2006 and was a very faithful donor for a long, long time. Now we have a number of other donors, similarly wealthy people, one from Germany named Michael Graver, a couple of other people, one from the UK named Jim Mellon, who gives us quite a bit. Possibly the most prominent one, and certainly at this point over the past year or so, the biggest one in terms of actual dollars, is Vitalik Buterin, who is the person who founded Ethereum, the number 2 cryptocurrency.
And what about Peter Thiel? What's his story?
Well, Peter got interested in this shortly after I met him back in 2005. And, we just talked about what this was all about. And even though he's not a biologist, the story that I was able to tell about how to go about defeating aging rang true with him. So he felt it was worth supporting. And, of course, he's not really in the donation business. He wants to make money. So his goal here was to help us along through what's often called the valley of death, where things need to move from the basic research phase into sufficiently far along so that other investors can come in and kind of see their way to eventually making a profit.
Well, I heard a lot about the Valley of Death at the conference. The panel that you were on, the kickoff panel, it was called The Future of the Science of Aging, and it was all the talk about the Valley of Death. And what was the figure, if I could sum it up from my brain bank here? It was the first pill is $26 billion. That's how much it costs to produce. And then the costs start to go down dramatically.
Well, I don't know where anyone pulled those numbers out of. Apart from anything else, there won't be just one pill. When these things are initially developed, a lot of the people who are funding the development have very deep pockets and will be willing to pay quite a lot of money to actually, force things forward. I remember back in the days of human genome sequencing, there was a guy named Dan Stoichescu who was basically the main funder of initial personal genome sequencing. He knew perfectly well that this reduction, this collapse in the price of human genome sequencing was going to occur, but he wanted to accelerate things. So he made essentially a philanthropic donation to get his own genome sequenced for far more than he would have had to spend even 1 or 2 years later, just in order to accelerate the field. And I believe that kind of thing is going to happen again.
The reason I ended up going down the funding track was just because I was reading up about you, and it was 20 years ago that you posited your 1,000-year person theory, and you got really no end of stick for that. But now all that skepticism seems to have evaporated. I mean, you were a kook 20 years ago. That's how your scientific peers viewed you. But now you're very much welcomed into the fold. And
let me slow you down a little bit there.
Okay.
So there are two kinds of thing that I was saying back then, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that both received a great deal of opposition back then. One of them was that we could, in the next maybe 20, 30 years, develop therapies that comprehensively repair the damage that the body does to itself throughout life well enough that we could give people an extra maybe 20 or 30 years of life. And furthermore, that we would give that life to people who were already 60 or 70 at that time. This is the rejuvenation I was talking about. That's one thing, and that certainly was regarded as very out there back then, whereas now it's very mainstream and orthodox, and a lot of people are basically reinventing the same idea and pretending it's original, and that's all very fine. But the other thing that I said back then, which is the one that you're focusing on, this longevity prediction, is something that nearly all of my colleagues still like to run away very fast when anyone mentions it to them, because they feel that even though it makes logical sense and it's quite likely to be true, nevertheless, politically it's incendiary, and they just don't want to be seen associating with those kinds of ideas. So, there's a kind of tacit, don't ask, don't tell kind of relationship that I have with my colleagues in the field in that regard. It's a small field. All the prominent people are great friends of each other, so we know how to work as a team, so to speak. For me to be out there as the maverick, taking the bullets and opening doors that the other people walk through and take the next step to actually make things happen.
I guess the arguments are always politically hard to swallow, and philosophers would suggest that society, should prevent inequality by extending lifespans because it'll only be for the rich.
Whereas, of course, this is crazy. It makes no sense at all to apply that kind of logic to this particular problem, not only because of what you already mentioned, the fact that any restriction on ability to pay will be temporary on account of prices coming down, but also, much more importantly, the fact that even at the beginning, when things are very expensive, it will be economically beneficial to any country, where even a private healthcare kind of country like the USA that really hates taxes, it will be economically beneficial, enormously beneficial, to ensure that these therapies are not restricted by ability to pay, because these therapies will pay for themselves. The fact is, prevention is better than cure. If you are keeping people from getting sick in the first place, then you spend less money than if you let them get sick and you try to keep them alive in that state. And moreover, of course, healthy people are able to contribute wealth to society rather than just consuming wealth. So whatever way you calculate it, it would be economically totally suicidal not to do the upfront investment that's required to ensure that everybody who's old enough to need these therapies actually gets them, even at the beginning.
You have said the alleged immutability of aging is no more. But even if you can make life-lengthening, age-defying modifications on a mass scale, society is not ready, as we've already broached politically, for medically engineered immortals.
Let me be clear about this. It's not actually true that society isn't ready for medically engineered post-aging world, which is the word I prefer to use because I think the word immortality has other meanings. It is ready. What it's not ready to do is to get its hopes up in anticipation of the time frame for the arrival of these things. You can be 100% certain that when these therapies do actually arrive, people are going to be as ready as you want. Everyone is going to make sure they get these therapies.
But how do you gauge that readiness now? I mean, have you been are you meeting people all the time? And is it all in the language that you use, how you're packaging up these therapeutics?
Yes, it is. It's all about the fact that longevity is a side effect of health. At this point, there is no controversy about curing Alzheimer's. Everyone wants to cure Alzheimer's. There is no controversy about any aspect of medicine. People want to be healthy. They even want each other to be healthy, with the possible exception of their mother-in-laws. But the fact is, the fixation that people have about this arises from the fact that the wish to be permanently healthy, to never get sick, however long ago you were born, is something that has pervaded civilization since civilization began. And we have been forced to make our peace with the situation, the fact that we can't do anything about it, to the extent of inventing and constructing all of these completely irrational rationalizations that persuade us that aging is actually some kind of blessing in disguise. Now, those rationalizations are completely irrational, and for that reason, they will collapse and evaporate on a dime once they're no longer needed. In other words, once the therapies exist. In fact, I believe that they're going to evaporate a good long time before then, perhaps in the next as few as 5 years, when results in the laboratory become sufficiently convincing that it ceases to be viable to maintain a position of skepticism.
How does organized religion factor into this? Do you get a lot of pushback from fundamentalists?
Actually, no. So, to some extent, maybe this will change over time. Maybe to some extent, I'm just not on their radar yet. But I believe that actually the main reason I don't get much pushback is because from a religious perspective, it's rather easy to see that this is actually a good thing. Fact is, when you just start from this thing I just mentioned, the fact that longevity is a side effect of health, there are two things that arise when you look at this from a religious perspective. The first one is, you're not like playing God or disrupting God's plan by developing these medicines, because God is omnipotent and he can perfectly well strike you down with a thunderbolt however healthy you are. And the second thing is that sickness is no fun. In other words, it is the main source of suffering in the world today. And of course, aging is the main source of sickness. Therefore, it's perfectly clear that if we want to follow what Holy Scripture says, and it doesn't matter which Holy Scripture you look at, in other words, if we want to minimize suffering in humanity, then it would be a sin not to work on this. And I've used this argument over and over again with people who come at me from a religious perspective, and it works rather well. I mean, I'm not saying they exactly turn around and say, oh dear, I hadn't thought of that, here is a last check. But they certainly go very quiet very quickly.
I think some of the pushback as well, let's set religion aside, but people look at how older people are treated now. Let's say you're lucky enough to get to 95 or 100, and there are few people that are compos mentis and physically agile and all the rest when they're over 100 at the moment. So people look at how older people live. They don't see that people can be vital and live on into a great old age. And economically, our systems are not set up for older people to keep living longer and longer and longer.
Well, so of course, this is completely wrong. But the reason it's completely wrong is the thing I already told you, that this longevity we're going to have is going to be a side effect of staying healthy. So the scenario that you're describing, which I agree, is indeed the scenario that a huge number of people cling to, is simply not the scenario that's going to occur. We are not going to have what Fukuyama called a global nursing home, in which we have a large number of sick people around because the sick people are staying alive in a bad state of health for a long time. That's not going to happen.
But people are already because of the way attitudes are about aging, people are already being consigned to uselessness in their 60s out of the labor force. So what are they going to do if 50 is half time and then you've got another 50 years, what are all the older, healthy people going to be doing with themselves?
Well, again, you've just got to be logical about this. You've just got to look at all of the factors. The fact is, first of all, the reason why we have this discrimination about older people today is because we don't have the medicines that I'm working to develop. In other words, because older people have a short time frame before they become unemployable because they're incompetent, because of physical and mental decline. And that is no longer going to be the case. So the scenario is a complete straw man. The other thing to be bearing in mind is that even in a scenario in which we have everybody being healthy and therefore competent to work, yes, we have a question of, what would they do? What if you've got all these people? Would younger people be able to get jobs and so on? But that too is an extremely short-sighted way of looking at the question, because it ignores what's already happening in terms of the rise of automation. Well before we get any kind of significant demographic shift as a result of the elimination of aging, we're going to have sufficiently sophisticated automation that pretty much all of the jobs that exist today are no longer going to exist. And that does not mean that there's a problem. It means that the world is going to be far more prosperous because we're not going to have to spend our time doing things that we wouldn't do unless we were being paid for them. What is, of course, a challenge is to figure out a good way to distribute that additional wealth, that additional prosperity equitably. And that's why people are looking at things like universal basic income right now. There's a long, long way to go for economists to develop a version of that system that really is robust and works well. And that's kind of, I wish economists would put more work into that. But the fact is that it's not going to be a problem. It's going to be the kind of problem we'd like to have.
Yeah, well, we'll all have to put our heads together in some sort of macro way to figure out how to live these longer years in good health, where everyone's contributing. People aren't sidelined, because right now people are being sidelined in their 50s and 60s, being chucked out of the labor force. And there is this entrenched attitude against older people, this decline. It's not a staircase to greater opportunity. And even people who've read about the happiness curve, they don't seem to want to buy into it. They just think, oh, well, you're older, you're over, shove along. Even though if you look at all of the literature and the data about demography and what's happening, there's an inverted age pyramid already happening. And, there aren't enough younger people being made to put everyone in the jobs that are going to be created. So we really do need to have some sort of a summit to figure all this out, but I don't know who does that.
It's easy to get people to put in the work to figure this out, to apply their expertise, whether it's in economics or in philosophy or in whatever, if we can persuade these people that this post-aging world is actually coming, that we are in striking distance of it. But the problem at the moment is that there is this, millennia-old conviction that aging is some kind of thing that we have to make excuses for. And that, we shouldn't be thinking about this. People have still got their heads in the sand, desperately so, despite progress that's been made. And when this changes, it's going to change very suddenly. There's going to be a really sudden sea change in terms of how society looks at aging. And people who make decisions, people who decide policies and so on, had better be ready for that in advance, because otherwise it's going to be unnecessarily turbulent.
What are you seeing just over the horizon in terms of aging research and development that we're not seeing?
Because I'm at the coalface, I see pretty much everything. And the fantastic news is that as of now, every single aspect of what I view as the essential components of aging research, of developing these damage repair technologies, is moving really fast. If you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would not have been able to say that, because there were at least a couple of areas where we were still really floundering and not really making significant progress. But that's no longer true. So at this point, it's really motoring. The other thing that's most important to mention here is the private sector. The fact that most of the fundamental projects, the really vital projects that we've been pursuing all of this time, have now got to a point of sufficient proof of concept that they've been able to be spun out into startup companies that are receiving investment. And sure enough, the actual number of dollars that they're receiving as a result is far greater than what they could ever have received via us through philanthropy. There's an awful lot of people out there who have ambition and vision and so on, and they understand the logic of all of this, but at the end of the day, they really don't like giving money away. Whereas if you offer them a value proposition, even if it's a really high risk, high reward one, they'll take it.
Well, you said the emerging longevity sector is huge and is going to be the biggest of all time, and you put a time on it within a decade. What do you see happening in 5 years?
I have, at this point, come to the conclusion that it's just completely impossible to predict. And the fundamental reason I've come to that conclusion is because over even the past 1 year, things have just greatly exceeded my highest expectations. I remember a year ago, at the beginning of 2018, I was asked to run a one-day satellite meeting of a big conference in San Francisco. And this satellite meeting was focused on showcasing a dozen or so of the startups that were pursuing some of the most important work in the rejuvenation sector. And first of all, the thing was totally oversubscribed. We had like 3 times more people in the audience than what we were expecting, and everyone had to stand. But the point is, in terms of the companies, I felt like I was pretty much on top of things. I had pretty much everybody there that was anybody at that point in terms of the presenters. This year, a year later, a month ago, I was asked to do it again, and I was completely underwater. This time I was able to invite more companies, and we had obviously a bigger room, so a lot more people in the audience as well. But the point is, I could have filled 3 days easily. There are so many companies coming along now, and the reason there are is because there is also a correspondingly rapid explosion of investors. The number of investors, the number of dollars that the investors are on average spending, it's insane. And I see this exponential growth continuing for a good while.
So everybody looks at it as a money spinner.
Well, at least the people who do look at it as a money spinner are driving it now. I won't say that I've done my bit and I can declare victory, because I've still got a huge role to play just in advising these investors and making introductions. But for sure, it's a hell of a lot easier to get stuff done now than it was when I was relying on donations.
Okay. Now, for your SENS Research Foundation, tell us about what you've identified as the 7 hallmarks of biological aging.
Sure. Well, so actually the word hallmarks was not my word. It was a word that was used about 6 years ago by a group that kind of reinvented my concept and pretended it was original.
Funny how that keeps happening, huh?
But of course, that's fine with me. As far as I'm concerned, if the mainstream catches up, then they can sure as hell take the credit, so long as they actually get listened to. And those people certainly are getting listened to. Now, the reinvention of my idea that they published was actually a little bit imperfect, but it was good enough. And they had 9 things, but that was just a different way of subdividing things. They actually left things out that I included. So my 7 were basically just very simple categories of the types of damage that occur in the body that accumulate over time and eventually contribute to the ill health of old age. So things like loss of cells. Well, what that means is if you've got an organ and cells die occasionally, then they need to be replaced by division of other cells. And if that doesn't happen, then, of course, the number of cells goes down, and eventually there are not enough cells for the organ to do its job, and that causes problems. There are various examples of that within aging. So Parkinson's disease is one example, where you've got a particular type of neuron in the brain that makes this chemical called dopamine, and we lose those neurons. So the way to fix it, of course, is stem cell therapy, to engineer cells in the laboratory so that we can inject them and they will divide and transform themselves into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And we have various other examples like that. For example, there are various situations in which cells may get into a bad state where they're doing more harm than good, and we need to get rid of them.
Are these the senescent cells?
Well, there's two types of way in which this can happen. One is if the cell is simply, it's fine, it might be doing its job, but it's dividing when it shouldn't. And that, of course, is more or less the definition of cancer. So we need to get rid of those cells before they divide so much as to be a problem. And then senescent cells, yes. Those are cells which are not necessarily dividing. In fact, they're usually not dividing. But what they're doing instead is they're secreting chemicals that are bad for their neighborhood. And so, again, they're doing more harm than good, and we need to get rid of those.
Would these be triggering, maybe not cancer, but autoimmune diseases, chronic autoimmune diseases?
Quite a few things, actually. In fact, cancer was the first one that was identified. It turns out that, yes, that some of the things they secrete are actually permissive for cancer in neighboring cells. But there's plenty of other things that go wrong. In fact, there's more than we would have thought. A few years ago, people developed a way to test this, to make mice that you could engineer so that they would develop a lot of senescent cells, and then you could magically get rid of those senescent cells just by giving them a simple drug in their drinking water. This is something where it only worked because of kind of being pre-engineered. It wouldn't work in a regular mouse. But so when you got rid of these cells, the mice were rejuvenated in a wide variety of different ways, much wider than we would have expected. And subsequent work over the past couple of years has shown that you can do the same thing with genetically normal mice that have not been prepared into a particular state in advance. So now this is a big deal, and actually that work has moved through to the early stage of clinical trials as of a few months ago. It's extremely exciting. The companies that are working on that are doing particularly well. One of them is now worth nearly $1 billion, and a number of the others, including one of our spin-outs, are doing pretty well. So, yeah, life is good.
Now, I guess I took you away from the 7 hallmarks of biological aging as titled by someone else. So can you continue down that track?
Sure. So I've gone through 3 of them so far. 1, having progressively too few cells of a particular type, and 2, that are having too many cells, either because they are dividing when they're not supposed to or because they're not dying when they are supposed to. Then the other 4 are actually not to do with number of cells, but to do with things at the molecular level. So first of all, there's a couple of things that happen inside cells. We have this thing called a mitochondrion, lots of them actually in most of our cells. And these are very vital components of the cell which perform the chemistry of breathing. What they do is they basically extract energy from nutrients by combining the nutrients with oxygen. And it turns out that that is actually a really hairy chemical process which creates toxins. And the reason that's a big problem is because mitochondria have their own DNA. This DNA gets damaged as a result, gets mutated, and the mutant DNA gets amplified, and eventually cells get in trouble. So we're trying to fix that, and we have a project which is doing pretty well now that involves essentially putting backup copies of the mitochondrial DNA into the normal DNA in our nucleus of the cell, in the chromosomes, modified in such a way that the DNA still works and creates the right thing even though it's in the wrong place. Then the other thing that goes wrong inside cells is just the accumulation of garbage, waste products. There are lots of different waste products that the cell makes all the time. Different cells make different ones. And most of them, it's not a problem because the cell has mechanisms for destroying or excreting that stuff. But there are some that accumulate so slowly that evolution hasn't taken the trouble to develop this repair machinery, this elimination machinery, because they could just accumulate in the cell and just be sequestered away, and they don't become a problem until old age. And by old age, evolution doesn't care anymore because you've already had your offspring. We need to fix that. We need to develop new ways to augment the machinery that the cell already has to get rid of most waste products so that it can get rid of these other really slowly accumulating ones. And we've found ways to do that by identifying bacteria and enzymes that those bacteria have, which are able to break these things down. And then again, we modify the enzymes so that they still work when we put them in a mammalian cell, in a human cell. And that has, again, been very successful. A couple of our spin-outs are based on that concept, focusing on macular degeneration, which is driven by the accumulation of a rather unusual derivative of vitamin A, and the other one focused on atherosclerosis, which is driven by the accumulation of an oxidation derivative of cholesterol. So that's the next one. Then we've got two left, and those are things that happen outside the cell, in the spaces between cells. One of them is, again, waste products just accumulating. And here we have the interesting shortcut where we don't need to introduce new enzymes. All we need to do is get the stuff to be engulfed, to get it from the outside of the cell into the inside.
I keep seeing Pacman in my brain, just little running around the cells and eating up all the rubbish.
Well, that's not a bad analogy, actually. So macrophages and microglia, that's what they do. And in the brain, this has already been successful. People have been able to identify ways to essentially stimulate the immune system of the brain so that microglia do exactly the Pacman thing. They swallow up this stuff because they recognize it as foreign. And once it's inside the cell, it gets destroyed pretty easily. And we have funded some work, which again has been spun out into a company, to do the same kind of thing for other kinds of waste products that accumulate between cells in the heart, among other tissues. And then the final one is elasticity. So the walls of our major arteries need to be elastic in order to kind of buffer the circulation against the heartbeat. You've got this constant oscillation of blood pressure, of course. And if that is not buffered, then you get problems further down in the more fragile parts of the circulation. In particular, the heart has to pump harder, so you get increase in blood pressure. And of course, that causes all manner of problems. And
so that's all seven. Sorry, go ahead.
And that happens because of chemical reactions between the proteins that the arteries are made of and sugar in the bloodstream. Those reactions cause new chemical bonds to be created, which basically just make the thing stiffer. And it's actually the same chemical reaction that happens in the skin and that contributes to wrinkling. So we want to fix all of that. We've got pretty close. And again, we've spun that project out into a company.
So is sugar something we should all be avoiding if we want to take steps so that we don't see these 7 hallmarks of biological aging?
I'm afraid it's not that simple. Not nearly that simple.
But is it a factor? I mean, we hear a lot about nutrition and lifestyle adjustments that we can make to stave off aging, ketogenic, keeping carbohydrates to 20 grams a day, intermittent fasting, getting away from everything that spikes your insulin.
Well, up to a point. But we've got to remember that sugar is an essential nutrient, very much in the same way that cholesterol is an essential molecule. If we didn't have cholesterol, our cell membranes wouldn't work and we'd be dead very instantly. So, if you think about what we have against atherosclerosis and heart disease today, the most popular interventions are statin, which are drugs that inhibit the body's ability to synthesize cholesterol. And if you have less cholesterol, then yes, you're going to have less oxidized cholesterol, and that means your atherosclerosis may be slightly retarded. But there's only so far you can go because you need your cholesterol.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that isn't the latest scientific thinking, as far as I understand it, and that's very superficial, my degree of understanding, that statins are to be avoided and try to stay away from carbs that instantly turn into sugar, because sugar is not something that you need.
Oh, it definitely is a macronutrient. You definitely need some carbohydrates.
But you can get them from vegetables. You don't need to get them from processed food.
You certainly don't need to get them from processed food, but the reason why vegetables are a source is because vegetables have sugar in them. Don't think that you're not getting any sugar if you're just eating vegetables.
But it's just, getting away from eating the huge plates of pasta after the baked potatoes and after the croissant for breakfast and the cereal. What about some of the other lifestyle strategies that you think people should follow to do their part in trying to live healthy for longer while we all wait for these therapeutics to come on stream?
So there's really 3 things I want to say about that. The first one is there is no such thing as generic advice here because different people are just too different. Different people have very different sensitivities to excessive intake of sugar, for example, or excessive intake of anything. Or they need more. Some people need more exercise than others. all these things, right? Everyone's different. So any particular recommendation of a diet, whether it's, whatever, whether it's Atkins diet or anything else, paleo diet, whatever, these things may be good for some people, they may not be good for other people. Therefore, there's only one actual piece of generic advice that one can give, which is pay attention to your own body. Do what works for you. If you're acting in a way that makes you not feel well when you wake up or the rest of the day, then don't do it. And that's pretty damned obvious. And that same applies to the third thing, which is basically just do what your mother said. Don't get seriously overweight, don't smoke, have a reasonably varied, balanced diet.
Eat real food and quit snacking.
Right. Well, not even necessarily quit snacking. I mean, snacking is more harmful for some people than for others. That's, again, the point. We need to understand, really, that we cannot significantly improve our longevity, our healthy longevity, just by doing things that are new and novel and unusual. Essentially, doing what your mother said is pretty much all you can do. And that, of course, leads to the last thing that I want to say, which is that there is one thing you can do to improve your chances of staying healthy a lot longer, which is improving your time frame for getting there. If you can't improve the time frame by lifestyle changes, then improve it in the other direction by hastening the development of the therapies that are going to make everything different, that are going to actually abolish aging, which means, of course, write me a large check.
I thought, where are you going with that? You've already got large checks. And I'm thinking I am in no position to be writing you any checks at all, large or little.
Let me elaborate, because the fact is that wasn't really a joke.
I know.
The need for large checks is just as big as it ever was. It's certainly good that we are getting heavy investment in some of the areas of damage repair that need to be developed. But there are other areas that have not yet become investable. They haven't got far enough along, and they still need plenty of philanthropic investment. And I also want to point out that I'm not just talking to billionaires here. I'm talking to everybody. Large numbers of small donations are just as good as small numbers of large donations. Furthermore, people like you are making a difference just by getting me on the radio. Getting the word out, the advocacy side is absolutely essential. And everybody can do advocacy. Everyone can go out there and, contribute to educating humanity. Whether it's you're talking to your colleagues or your family or your friends, doesn't matter. Just get people to take this seriously and not be so cowardly about making their peace with aging and pretending that it's never going to be amenable to medical intervention, because that simply is not the case.
I think it's hard because of all the cultural conditioning, the social conditioning we've got, to start thinking, as you do, of aging as a unitary disease.
Well, I didn't say it was hard. It wasn't hard. But the fact is, we've still got to do it. And don't call aging a disease, or let alone a unitary disease. It's neither of those things.
But this is what I learned from the conference. This was all over the conference agenda in the keynote panel discussions. So you say no to all that?
I'm quite sure I didn't say that aging is a disease. People often say that I say that aging is a disease. But the fact is, I think that the definition of the word disease should not be broadened to include aging. Rather, it should actually be narrowed, because we have a huge problem today that some things that are actually aspects of aging are called diseases. Alzheimer's disease, for example, Parkinson's disease. These are not diseases. They're aspects of aging that we've chosen to give disease-like names to. And that's a really important correction to make, because if we call them diseases, then we are seduced, we are lulled into the completely erroneous perspective that we might be able to cure them, eliminate them from the body in the way that we would eliminate an infection, which is not true, because the fact is these things are side effects of being alive, and they're going to happen if we don't treat them like aging. The only way to treat aging is the way we treat aging of a car or whatever. In other words, periodic, comprehensive damage repair, preventative maintenance.
Isn't it funny, because that term, unitary disease, was all over all of the materials at the Longevity Leaders Conference. But I suppose I won't get hung up on that. But it's because I'm a neophyte. This is all new to me and really fascinating. But I want to direct you back to something that you wrote in 2005, Journal of Medical Ethics, Life Extension, Human Rights, and the Rational Refinement of Repugnance. Quite a title for the article. And from that, you've written, once we realize that our failure to set aside irrationality about longevity, our determination to consign human aging to history will be second only to our shame that we took so long to do it. You say to break out of our collective trance. You still think that?
Absolutely. I think it's an extremely accurate way of describing the situation. The fundamental difficulty we have right now is that the irrationality that we exhibit when we discuss aging, when we think about aging, it's no exaggeration to call it a trance. It reminds me of a situation that I actually saw when I was an undergraduate, when I went to a stage hypnotist show. And what happened was that the performer would get this subject on stage and get him into a nice deep trance. And then he would say, it would convince him, he would tell him something that wasn't true. I mean, it was actually like, he would switch the person's elbows. He would say, he'd point to the person's left elbow and say, okay, this is your right elbow. He'd point to the other elbow and say, this is your left elbow. And he got them to completely believe that. And then he would say things like, please touch your right elbow with your left forefinger, things like that. But then he would get the subject to explain why he couldn't touch his left elbow with his right forefinger. And the subject would give a lucid explanation, no hesitation, no grammatical slips or anything, as completely having no trouble constructing the most absurd logic. And this was a bright guy, an undergraduate at University of Cambridge, along with me, and he just could not remotely see what was wrong with what he was saying.
So you think we've all been culturally brainwashed?
Absolutely. We've collectively brainwashed ourselves over millennia because we have had no choice. Until I came along, this was actually the rational thing to do, right? What you had to do was get used to the fact that you were going to get sick and die on a reasonably predictable time frame, and you didn't want to spend your life being preoccupied by that terrible thing that was going to happen. You needed to put it out of your mind and get on with your miserably short life, right?
But we all think of the arc of life, the natural process of birth, adolescence, middle age, decline, and then eventual death.
That's what people have chosen to think. That's right, simply because it helps them put the whole grim business out of their minds. And that is the right thing to do when you have no other plan. But the fact is, we're not in that situation anymore. We do have a plan. We do have a way forward to develop medicines that will consign aging to history in exactly the same way that we've already consigned tuberculosis and diphtheria to history. And it's about time we recognize that so that we get it done quickly. Because the fact is, at this point, we are losing 100,000 odd people every day worldwide. And there will come a point when those people are dying unnecessarily because we could have developed therapies to save them, but we didn't get on with it quickly enough. And that's what I talked about with regard to shame.
Well, I guess if I'm reading you right, the current approaches to gerontology and geriatrics, you would say, are not sufficient. We don't have sufficiently developed tools to effectively slow aging. So now we lose people because we intervene at a late stage.
Let me elaborate. Let me clarify that a little bit, because you got that mostly right. So geriatric medicine is indeed intervening too late, trying to treat Alzheimer's disease as if it were an actual disease rather than as a part of aging. And similarly, all the other things that go wrong with us late in life, but not early in life. It doesn't work. It's completely quixotic. It's obvious that it will never work because these things are consequences of the accumulation of damage, and the damage is continuing to accumulate as the person gets older. But it's also completely hopeless to slow down the rate at which the body generates this eventually pathogenic damage, because that involves tweaking the way that metabolism works. And metabolism is just too complicated for that. The creation of damage is just too intrinsic. So instead, we have the far more practical option, which is exactly what we already do with simple man-made machines like cars, namely to let the damage be created at the natural rate, because that's how it is, but then to repair that damage reasonably often, reasonably well, so that it doesn't accumulate to a level that's pathogenic, that's bad for us. In other words, we keep it within the zone that the body is set up to tolerate.
So lifelong tweaks as we go.
Yeah, just like for cars or airplanes or whatever, periodic preventative maintenance. And we can see that it works. The cars that are driving around today that are more than 100 years old, that are going from London to Brighton every year, those cars are not ones that were designed to last 100 years. They were designed to last 10 years or 15 at the outside. And the reason they are still there at 10 times older than they were ever designed to get is simply because preventative maintenance works.
But then we're getting into swapping out every single part. And it brings to mind the transhumanism movement. What do you think of this whole movement, where it's kind of, humans 2.0 with robotic input?
Right. So, let me be clear. I do think that the goals of people who like to call themselves transhumanists are generally completely sane, completely sensible, whether it's developing molecular manufacturing or cryonics or artificial general intelligence. All of these things are completely just as valuable goals for technology as the defeat of aging. They will improve the quality of life, the human condition, in many ways. What I'm much less in favor of is the language. I think the word transhumanism itself is greatly counterproductive, because it does actually conjure up images of the sort that you just gave, the idea that we're creating humans 2.0. That's not true. What this is all about is simply a continuation of the progress of technology that we've seen in the past, and that almost everybody is rather happy about. I mean, we've got this thing called the internet, and this is improving life. We've got this thing called fire and the wheel. It's been a constant progression, and we're rather pleased that it all happened. So it's going to be exactly the same for the technologies that are coming that currently go often under the heading of transhumanism. And therefore, I think that a word like that sounds terribly scary, is actually very poor marketing.
Thinking about your own aging, would you do anything, I can't think of what, but something that might in 40 years, you're 55 now, something that might be construed as on the outer fringe of extreme? Can you see yourself opting for that so that you can stick around and carry out your research?
Well, of course, I'm at the cutting edge of all of this. So things that might seem extreme to most people might be things that I'd already got used to. And plus, we also need to take into account that things that everyone thinks is extreme, only a couple of years later, they're perfectly normal. So, this is all relative. But for sure, I'm not keen on getting sick any more than anybody else is. On the one hand, of course, I am nevertheless very aware of the safety issues. Any medicine, and this is not going to change, any medicine when it's first developed is necessarily an experiment, and it may entail risks. And if I can manage to achieve longevity, escape velocity only by benefiting from medicines that have already been well tested by other people, then that's so much the better. But if I end up being rather closer to the cusp and I have to take some risks, well, so be it.
Longevity, escape velocity?
Right, that's the word that I use to describe the concept of bootstrapping the rejuvenation process, whereby we start out with therapies that are not perfect by any means, and they will only repair most of the damage that we do to ourselves throughout life, as a result of which they only confer maybe 20 or 30 years of additional life. But then during that time, we improve the therapies so that they can repair some of the damage that the first version could not repair, and so we stay one step ahead of the problem. This is what leads me to these extreme predictions of how long people are going to live, even people who are alive today.
What are you personally doing? Are you taking a mitt full of vitamins every morning? Any lifestyle strategies that you've adopted for yourself, just your own personal regime?
I'm not a good example to follow here for two reasons. First of all, because I am biologically very lucky. I have been tested half a dozen times over the past 15 years for my biological age, and I always come out extremely young. So, obviously I'm built well in the first place, and that means that I have to be rather conservative and take an if it ain't broke, don't fix it attitude. But the other thing is that, of course, I'm, spearheading this movement and I'm saving lives, and that's a big driver. So I run myself into the ground. I definitely don't get nearly enough sleep, and I'm quite sure that that's bad for me. So you definitely shouldn't be doing what I do. You should be doing what I say.
And one more thing I want you to say, Aubrey de Grey. What are we going to see in future? In the history books, we're going to have a few lines about Aubrey de Grey, biomedical gerontologist. What else is it going to say?
God only knows. I don't think about legacies and stuff like that. After all, I'm not planning to have a legacy because I'm not planning to die. So, as far as I'm concerned, the contribution I'm making every day to helping to hasten the defeat of aging and saving all these lives, that's all the reward I need.
Dr. Aubrey de Grey is a biomedical gerontologist based in Mountain View, California, and Cambridge here in the UK, where he got his BA and PhD working in computer science before switching to biogerontology. He's the Chief Science Officer of the SENS Research Foundation he created, a charity dedicated to combating the aging process. It's been absolutely fascinating. A real delight to speak with you some more, Aubrey. I didn't get enough at the conference.
Thank you very much, Susan.
How to connect with Aubrey de Grey and his work, it'll be in the show notes. You can head to susanflory.com, Apple, Google, Spotify, all your favorite pod apps, and to subscribe to the podcast. And a big thank you for your rating and your review on Apple Podcast. They really do help get the big middle in more ears. Until next week, bye-bye.